Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Education Writers Association for this webinar on an education reporter's guide to covering the youth vote. I'm Emily Richmond, EWA's public editor. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator. Elizabeth Hernandez covers higher education for the Denver Post, and she's been paying close attention to the youth vote in that state. And we've asked her to guide this conversation. So Elizabeth, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Emily, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This panel is intended to help reporters cover the 2020 youth vote during a year when there is so much election misinformation and changes to norms. We know that historically young people vote at lower levels, and there are additional obstacles this year making it even tougher for college students to vote, including fewer polling stations on college campuses and confusion over voter registration rules for students who have moved back home during the pandemic. Topics today will include voter access, voter education, how race and ethnicity factor into youth voting patterns, and how the COVID-19 pandemic is changing how, where, and why students are casting ballots this November. And we have some excellent panelists here to help us out. We have Chadwick Leonard. Chadwick is Florida State Coordinator of the Fair Election Center's Campus Vote Project and manager of the organization's HBCU Legacy Initiative. In 2012, Fair Election Center launched Campus Vote Project to focus and expand its work around student voting issues. Since then, Campus Vote Project has been working to normalize and institutionalize student voting by working directly with colleges and universities across the country. Chadwick recently wrote a column for the Tampa Bay Times headlined "Black Youth Can Decide Florida's Elections" that discusses many of the obstacles Black youth face when it comes to voting. We also have Jessica Huseman. Jessica covers voting rights and election administration for ProPublica. She is the lead reporter for ProPublica's Election Land project, which helps hundreds of newsrooms across the United States cover ballot access issues in real time. Prior to covering elections, she covered health and education issues, especially those impacting children. Prior to becoming a journalist, she was a high school history teacher and debate coach in Newark, New Jersey. Thank you both so much for being here. All right, well, let's start with questions. Let's see. We do know that a Washington Post story published Wednesday revealed Republican activist Charlie Kirk sharing his delight about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on America's universities during a meeting of the Council for National Policy, which included many conservative activists and donors. The quote in this story here is, "So please keep the campuses closed," Kirk said. It's a great thing. So how should reporters approach covering youth voter suppression? And this is a question for anyone who wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. And sorry, my camera for some reason is not working, so I'm just kind of a disembodied voice. But this is Jessica. I think that the Washington Post story is certainly troubling. It is not in any way surprising. There is a underlying sort of philosophy within very conservative parts of the Republican Party, whose voices are quite loud in this administration, that that youth votes will always be for Democrats, and so instead of doing youth outreach, they should just prevent youth from voting. And that is borne out in the quotes that you heard from Charlie Kirk, who is a lunatic, but here we are. And I think that I'm of two minds of this piece. On one hand, they obviously didn't achieve the aims that they expressed in the Washington Post piece around reducing vote by mail, keeping campuses closed, which clearly hasn't happened, as all of you higher education reporters know, because you've had to become health reporters. So, they've achieved this, though, in other ways with varying degrees of success. And I'm happy to talk through a lot of those as I go through my slides. But I think that the most sort of direct impact for students is that there are fewer polling locations on campuses than there have been in the past. And that certainly suggests some level of success with the themes that we read in that Washington Post article.
Yeah, and I'll definitely add to that. just as a note, like in the video, we clearly see that Charlie Kirk's comments are still based on the idea of voter fraud, because he says, they're missing out on harvesting ballots and they're missing out on the voter fraud when it comes to vote by mail. And because we know about the very, 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 very low chance of voter fraud that already occurs, I think like what Jessica said, although that is their sentiment, it's not based on truth. There are many colleges that are still open and that are still doing great work to kind of get their students engaged with the right information. And so, as you all report on this, I think it'll be very good to highlight that the basis of his comments is the idea that voter fraud is rampant, which more so fuels his excitement about the perceived lack of student voter engagement and student voting as a whole.
Excellent. And I know, Jessica, you mentioned your slides, and for a reminder for everyone watching, Jessica is audio only right now. So let's have Jessica present her slides.
Okay, great. So this is just the title screen, but this is my contact information. So if you have any additional questions or you want to talk about your locality specifically, please feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, or honestly by email is probably much more reliable. But I'm happy to do individualized trainings for your newsroom on local voting issues. I'm also happy to talk to you more specifically about how Election Land, which is ProPublica's project for covering the election, which is free to join, costs no dollars, and you are under no obligation to use anything that we give you. It could not be easier. If you want to talk specifically about how Election Land can help you cover the issues that I'll talk about in these next 3 slides, please reach out. I'm happy to have that conversation with you and then get you onboarded. All right, let's go. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so I think the first thing to know about elections is that they are all local. The person that is going to impact a student's ability to vote the most directly is their local clerk. Sometimes these folks have different names. It might be a supervisor of elections or a registrar or something like that. But there is always a local elections office in some capacity, and that elections office is going to be the one that is most directly communicating with folks at your local colleges and universities about registration drives and the location of polling locations on campus and how many there should be, if there should be any at all. And so one of my best pieces of advice for people who are interested in covering student voting is to figure out who is on the election staff at the municipal or county office, and then file a records request for their communication with people at the university by email using the university's email extension. And this will tell you sort of how clerks are communicating with students about their rights and where polling locations will be, and what discussions they're having with administrators about the concerns of the administrators holding votes on campus. Sort of famously at this point, I don't know how this resolved, the University of Georgia wasn't going to have any polling locations on campus and was instead going to be busing students to another location, which seems like such a bad idea. I can't even really express it in words. But the administrators who are expressing concern about their ability to conduct elections safely, those conversations would likely happen with the local clerk's office, and it's interesting to see what those are. There's also data to show you where polling locations have been located on or near campuses. You can get this data from a couple of places. You can get it from your state, you can get it from the county, or you can get it even from some federal agencies. Democracy Works, which is a nonprofit, not a federal agency, has a national list of all polling locations. And so they are often happy to do data polls for you. and I think that there are some good questions to ask about polling locations on campuses. Do they have more now? Do they have fewer? And the question that you need to ask in a more nuanced way is, if there are fewer, do they have more or less capacity? Because it could be that because we need to social distance now, they have combined 3 polling locations on campus into one very large one with 3 precincts inside of it, like in a basketball stadium or in the football stadium, so that there's air circulation and people can social distance. So I wouldn't immediately call the reduction in the total number of polling locations a bad thing until you ask questions about capacity and how many machines they'll have, how many poll workers they'll have, how many people will be able to vote at one time. Those are much more nuanced questions that will get you closer to the right answer. And what I have found, at least anecdotally in my own reporting, is that HBCUs in small towns that whose demographics are very different from the college that is within it. So a good example of this is Prairie View A&M, which is in Waller County in Texas. It's a predominantly white community, but the campus is almost all Black. They are often waging their own little voting wars that have gone on for decades. Like, the students at Prairie View A&M are so engaged and so aware of their rights because Waller County routinely takes them away. And so if you happen to be in a place in which there is a college whose demographics are very different from the surrounding community, it is almost predictable that the county office is going to give students incorrect information about voting. There are, of course, exceptions to that rule, and I think even Waller County has gotten much better over time as the national spotlight has sunk on them every year, but these problems are still very much an issue. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then, obviously we're in a pandemic. Vote by mail is going to be different for students than it is for most people. It may be that a student who's registered because they want to be politically active in the place where they spend the most of their time has their campus address associated with their registration. If the registrar's office or the clerk's office is not doing outreach by email, or they don't have that capacity, or they don't have an additional address for the student, it would be interesting to see what their plan is for communicating with students who are not on campus and don't have access to their post box on campus. It could be that the campus has figured out how to deal with this and is forwarding mail. It could be that they're scanning mail and sending it along. If it is that students are receiving absentee ballot applications directly to a mailbox that they do not have access to, how do they do that? Is there a process with the local elections office and the school to make sure that that bridge is built? The student affairs office is probably your best bet for figuring out what, if anything, they are doing to help facilitate absentee voting with their students, as they would if their students were on campus. But I think that this in my mind remains the biggest concern that I have about student voting and how they're communicating where they're registered, or if some of them have taken steps to cancel their registration and register where they currently are. I just think that that's an interesting sort of cultural moment that we find ourselves in. All right, next slide. So this is my last slide, and I just want to point out that elections don't just happen at colleges. 17-year-olds can register to vote if they'll be 18 by election day, and 18-year-olds are still basically high school seniors. So in addition to covering this from a higher education perspective, K12 reporters should be doing a lot of work figuring out what kind of outreach these teenagers are getting from their county offices, and what kind of opportunities schools are giving them to do things like register to vote. So there is a law in Texas, for example, that every high school senior has to be given at least 2 opportunities to register to vote at school during their senior year. That law is almost uniformly ignored. So, there are similar laws, maybe not to that magnitude, about access to voter registration registration forms or the way students can be excused from school if they need to go vote because there is no early voting in their state. And so those are good questions to ask. And I also, want to point out that there are a lot of places that let 17-year-olds, even though they can't vote, be poll workers, which is great. It's like a really wonderful way to get involved in the civic process. So for example, Hamilton County, Ohio, does this hilarious thing that is so effective. They were struggling with the number of poll workers that they had, and they also realized that their aging poll workers just like weren't adapting to the technology that they needed to implement to speed up voting. And so what they chose to do was have 17 and 18-year-olds at all of the county's high schools do a competition. And so the school that got the most poll workers got a pizza party paid for by the county. And it was alarmingly successful. Hundreds of teenagers in Hamilton County serve as poll workers. And, I just can't really imagine a better form of civic education than that. Like those kids will be voters for the rest of their lives. And I just think that that's so great. And so, these are questions that maybe should be asked of county clerks, like, what are you doing to engage older teenagers? There are states, for example, that will bring election equipment to high schools so that they can vote for like their class president on it to introduce them to the concept of voting and get them comfortable with it. Rhode Island does this every year, for example, and Ohio does this as well. There are a couple of states that have really, really great outreach to high schools, and then there are states that don't even bother. So figuring out which your state is a valuable thing to know, because those kids are going to go on to college and then they're going to continue being involved in the process, but probably at their own behest. And so if we can build that foundational skill now and they can use it later, then that's just valuable for democracy as a whole. So that's kind of my whole spiel, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. I have so many ideas now for stories.
Oh, good.
All right. And I will get back to questions for both of you, but why don't we move to Chadwick's slides now, or Chadwick's presentation?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have any slides. It's just a couple of points I just wanted to put out there for some possible angles and some possible ways to think about capturing the work that's going on these campuses and capturing what is happening on these campuses. With Campus Vote Project, we're a nonpartisan organization, so our main thing is trying to get students to understand the mechanics of voting, understand the process of voting and where that goes. One of the ways that we do that is through our Democracy Fellowship. The Democracy Fellowship is almost like a civic training program where we give the students the tools that they need in order to work on their campus, as opposed to hiring staff to be on that campus. We train the students who already know the culture, who already know who to talk to get things done on their campus. And what we're seeing is that students are not apathetic about what's going on. Students are even more charged and are still working harder through all of the changes. We have about 300 fellows now across 10 states. And what we've seen is that the students are just as concerned as everybody else. Like Jessica said, elections don't only happen on colleges, but these students on these college campuses, and even the students that are displaced, are still doing work for their college campuses. And that's another thing that we are starting to see, the real idea of community when it comes to this, and working with community on your college campuses as far as the students go. Because although they are displaced, some students are displaced, they're still interacting with the same students, the same clubs, the same administrators that they would if they were on campus, and still doing that work for their campus and for the idea for their campus to be, have voting as an identity of their campus and voting as a part of their matriculation experiences. One of the things that we are also seeing is that students are being disenfranchised inadvertently because of bad information on the part of the campuses in most states. I know in Florida, where I am located, the campuses are responsible for offering opportunities in order for students to register to vote. And they must provide ways to register to vote, and they must provide forms. But because of COVID, what we've seen is a shift towards things like using the tools that they already have to kind of continue those things where they can't have forums, they can't do physical things. So some of the things that we've seen are bulletins on Blackboard, bulletins in emails. We've also seen some things where students are getting masked, getting passed out masks if they are on campus in an effort to continue that feeling of safety so they can vote. In the area of polling places and polling locations, most of the concern that we've seen has been, is it even safe to have them? We have been working with Plus One to Polls and Power to Polls to protect campuses who have early voting polling places and general election polling places on their campus. And even where we have students who are volunteering, the question is it safe at this point? What kind of PPE are they being provided? Is that PPE being provided by the school, or is that PPE being provided by the supervisor of elections? And so those are some of the things that we've run into, and I'll bring up historically Black colleges and universities as well, given our legacy initiative that we started in 2019. What we've seen there, much like Prairie View A&M, is that the students at historically Black colleges and universities suffer from the barriers that affect the Black voting population as well as the student population all at the same time. And those barriers have proven to be things that continue to sprout up like weeds. And with things like funding, with things like COVID and displacement, all of that is what is going on. They're facing even more of a barrier when it comes to that, more than usual. So what we've seen is we've seen a number of HBCU summits. We've seen a number of things happen specifically for HBCUs to fight that. But what has been most effective with HBCUs is providing more funding for them to do this work. Because on some colleges, on predominantly white institutions, they have whole departments for civic engagement and democratic activity. On lots of HBCUs, you have one person who this is just one responsibility. And so what we've been trying to do as Campus Vote Project is provide opportunities for funding, provide resources for them to create plans in order to engage their campus even throughout this time, especially for the smaller private historically Black colleges and universities where this impact has been felt. And so with that being said, I think it's very important as you go out to cover stories to also focus on the fact that students are still working, students are still excited, and the idea of student apathy towards government and towards election has proven to be, if not all the way, but at least partially defunct, because these students are working even harder through their fellowships through this time for them to get things done on their campus.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chadwick. And I have just a follow-up question. I know reporters are going to be wondering, can you expand on some of the barriers that Black youth and students of color face when it comes to voting, so reporters can kind of know what to be looking for and what they should be asking questions about?
Yeah, most definitely. So one of the largest things is disinformation and misinformation. As we saw from many articles and many studies, the Black population, the Black voting population as a whole, was a great target for disinformation and misinformation during 2016, and that has ramped up. And even with college students on the campuses of historically Black colleges and universities, what we've seen is the mix of intercultural conversations and disinformation, and those conversations being used as a way to dissuade people from voting altogether. To ideas of, well, the vote doesn't matter anyway, and you see what happened in 2016, why vote at all? Focus on other things besides voting, and what that does is that puts a barrier in the middle of the conversation of why you should vote in the first place, within which puts a barrier between the idea of voting and the mechanics of voting amidst everything. Because what we've seen in just general studies is that the more someone is turned away from the polls or is presented with a barrier, the less likely they are to try to vote again. And so what we're seeing is not just the turn away of a voter for this election, we're seeing a turn away of a lifetime voter who may not go back to the polls because of the idea of misinformation and disinformation and all of the regular barriers that have been put in their way from the jump.
Great, thank you so much. And I have a question for Jessica now. Jessica, we know this is a year when election misinformation and confusion is running rampant. What are some pitfalls reporters should look out for, or anything you'd like to kind of debunk or set the record straight that might help reporters better frame their stories?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, I see reporters, I was particularly disappointed to see this in Politico today, quoting people who have been just repeatedly debunked because they're trying to find this false sense of balance. So if we talk about voter suppression, then, oh, I guess we have to call the Heritage Foundation and talk about voter fraud. You don't. You do not have to do that, and you shouldn't. You should not quote people whose theories have been repeatedly debunked across multiple platforms. The other thing that I would say is that you should not assume that you know how elections work. Even if you've talked to the election administrator, even if you've voted before, you should make sure that you actually understand exactly how the votes are counted, how the votes are mailed out, how the ballots are designed, how the envelopes that mail the ballots out are designed, and what the process looks like when those ballots come back. I've seen a lot of sly disinformation that I don't think was intended to be disinformation, but was nonetheless not accurate about how votes are counted or how drop boxes work. And so I think that the most important thing for you to do is to go meet your county election official in person, to attend poll worker training. Media is almost always allowed to do that. Most counties have test voting machines set up with dummy ballots, so you can cast a ballot for Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck in the lobby so that you can understand how the machines work, so that if somebody says that the machines are wrong on election day, then you have a bit more knowledge on how that might have happened. And then you can also go watch the votes being counted. This might be less of a thing now that we're in the middle of a pandemic, but there are a lot of counties that are now going to live stream the whole counting process. So I think that if you're going to cover the youth vote well, then you need to understand how voting works, and that's actually really easy to do. You just have to kind of make a relationship with the county's office.
Excellent, thank you so much. And now, Chadwick, I have another one for you. Chadwick, what are the kinds of questions you most frequently hear from college students around voting? I know so many reporters try to serve their readers by giving them the tools they need to make informed decisions. So what sorts of questions should reporters kind of be addressing in their reporting?
Yeah, so especially with this time, a few questions that we've gotten most from students is the idea of vote by mail and the security of vote by mail, because it's become a big conversation now. It's almost new to the students about how this works, especially if you're a student who went to a college in your state or in your county. And so what are the procedures in order to make sure that their vote is counted? What is a provisional ballot, and why would I need to cast a provisional ballot? Sort of things that students are asking, as well as the idea of, if I am home and I register to vote in college, but now I'm back home, am I allowed to register to vote again? And do I get to vote in both places, and things like that? And just letting them know that, no, once you register to vote in one place, that automatically invalidates your vote and your registration in another place. So you don't have to do that, as well as the idea of, what do I need when I'm going? Because for a lot of these students, this is the first time that they'll be able to vote, and them voting in the pandemic with so many different things going on, like what type of ID do I need? And because in many states like North Carolina, Florida, and Wisconsin, and different places, there's a contention around student voting IDs and whether that counts when you get to the polls. And then another question that we've had asked is, what if my vote by mail ballot doesn't show up in time? What do I do? Can I still show up to the polls? What are the stages and how do I prepare myself for that? And one of the things that what we've been telling students for all those things is now the onus is put on the voter more now than ever to not just register the right way, but to confirm your registration and to make sure, if your state is a state that is notorious for purging voter rolls and things like that, make sure that you're still on the roll if you haven't voted in a while, or make sure that if you are doing vote by mail, you follow every single instruction on the ballot and on the envelope, as well as make sure your signature matches if you have a copy of your original voter card and things like that. So just we try to give them the tools to get the right information in enough time. So like I said, most of the questions have been around contingency plans. Most of the questions have been around making a plan if things do go wrong for the plan that they already have.
Great, thank you. And this is a question that I'm sure both of you can answer, so feel free, whoever wants to jump in. Obviously, COVID-19 has changed a lot of things this year, but how has it impacted the youth vote? I know there are some things like voter engagement on college campuses. What does this mean for the youth vote? What are the concerns around this, and what should reporters be looking for?
You know, I think one of the things that concerns me broadly, but I think has specific application to the youth vote, is that a lot of people, especially new voters, register when they have sort of an accidental opportunity to. So they will come across a voter registration table at their campus or at the grocery store or in front of a bar, and they'll register to vote, and that will be their introduction to the process. Those things are not happening right now. And so it would be interesting to look and see if your county keeps data on registration, and if you can compare registration for on-campus students to the registration this year. And that would be a little bit of a complicated data feat because you would have to know the addresses at which students register on campus. But if they're flagged, or if there's a number of voters assigned to a given polling location, perhaps that could be a proxy for this. So I'm worried that not as many students will have registered to vote as is normal. And then, you know, I think another thing that always bothers me about the way that reporters cover the youth vote is that they sort of play into this narrative that is just bantered about by both parties, really, that, well, young people just don't vote. They aren't engaged. They aren't civically engaged, and we can't rely on them to turn out and yada, yada, yada. I mean, that's offensive, first of all. It is completely logical to me that an 18-year-old who's never voted before probably votes at a lower rate than their 65-year-old grandmother. So, you know, I think that having a realistic understanding of how difficult it is to vote can shine a bit of a light on whether or not 18-year-olds should vote. Campaigns generally don't do a ton of youth outreach. They generally don't do a ton of youth get out the vote because they feel like it's not worth their time. And I feel like that's a bit of a circular problem. And now that the pandemic is on and there are fewer large events at campuses, there are even fewer opportunities for campaigns to do what little outreach they do. And I think that the media can kind of step in and in a nonpartisan way fill this hole. So, you know, we can work with campus newspapers to co-publish articles about voting on campus. If you're writing an article that involves the campus, then maybe reach out to the local student newspaper and see if they want to help you with the story, and then you can co-publish it in both places. And so you can sort of fill the information gap in that way, but we just have to be willing to be collaborative.
Yeah, and I'll definitely add to that. I think another thing to look out for is, or to think about is, reason why the youth vote is important right now and why it's so important. Because it's important for a different reason now, because between millennials and Gen Z, that makes the largest voting bloc, right? And it's not just important because of the ideology of younger people. It's not just important because people think that it's more democratic. It's important because how this bloc votes is going to basically shift the country over the next few years, because they're going to be the largest voting bloc for a number of years. And so if you can get an idea of how these individuals vote and how and if they vote, then you can kind of shape elections for the next few years in that way, as well as what we've seen is what can help is the idea of voting as the ultimate thing to do and not the beginning of a civic engagement cycle. Because I think a lot of times students are presented voting as this is the ultimate thing you can do as an American. This is the ultimate thing you can do as a patriot. But we don't talk about civic engagement between elections, which increases the idea and the desire to vote once you not only see how things work, once you are able to hold people accountable or able to see how the different laws, the different candidates and everything react after the voting process. And just making sure that students understand that in a way where they're not only identified as voters, but they're identified as being civically engaged and being more engaged in a way where they understand the process of democracy and not just the act of voting itself.
Great. Well, I have one more question, then I know we're going to head to audience questions soon, but I would love to hear from both of you, just any story ideas you have, if there's are things that you think haven't been covered enough or underreported, or just something you think would be interesting for a reporter to cover around the youth vote. Would love to hear from both of you.
Yeah, I would love to get I would love for the reporting on youth voting to be a little bit more data driven than I find it to be. I'm always disappointed when I look for stories on the youth vote that a lot of them are, make sweeping negative conclusions about how the county is handling the youth vote without a lot of nuance, or conversely, they talk about how great and engaged the students are without delving into the populations that might not be as engaged. And so I think taking a more data-driven look at what's going on can only benefit you in terms of the actual truth of the matter. And so, I think that one story that I would love for folks to tell is the decreasing number of early and on voting day voting locations on campus. And then also stories about how clerks very frequently will give incorrect information to students, and sometimes that's intentional, sometimes it's not. It is, for example, very common for clerks to tell students that if they register to vote in the county, that might impact their financial aid in some way because they would be attesting that they no longer are a dependent of their parents. That is absurd. That is not the case. And there are only few states with very strict residency requirements, but these are the kind of things that clerks tell students. And whether that's because they really don't want them to register or because they are genuinely, although incorrectly, concerned is kind of up for you to decide. But that's why I would encourage you guys to file those records requests for communication with students by email. And then, it may be that your county does some specific tracking of the youth vote. And this is pretty common in counties where the student population is quite large. So for example, the University of Missouri is in Columbia, Missouri, which is not a big town, but the University of Missouri is huge. And so they have specific programs for those students. And I would assume that they measure engagement, they measure the number of students they were able to register so that they know how effective those programs are going forward. And you can ask for that data to see how their efforts this year compare to efforts in 2016, and how much of that is because they were unable to do so because of the pandemic, and how much of that is for other reasons.
Yeah, I would definitely say put the students at the forefront. I think that's something that I would like to see, because like Jessica said, a lot of times students are talked about from a perspective like you haven't had an opportunity or there are no students to talk to, but putting students at the forefront to talk about how the creative action that they've taken on their campuses in order to keep the work going, as well as from that data point that Jessica talked about as well. There's a study called the National Study for Learning, Voting, and Engagement that tracks student voting, and it breaks things down to state, city, majors, ethnicity, age, traditional students, non-traditional students, to kind of get an idea of how students have been voting over the years, because this is going to be a very different election. This is already a very different election. So I think putting students and the work that they're doing in the forefront would definitely help to get another view of the challenges. I mean, because even here with me talking to students, I don't have the complete student perspective, and the different worries that the students have and the different ideas that the students have about how this election has affected them. And you can do that in a number of ways. Like I said, we have fellows that we can help interview, and you have other organizations out there who are still working with students who can get you in touch with students based on the state that you're in. So I would definitely say that put students in the forefront so you can get a more well-rounded idea of what's going on from a data perspective, from a government perspective, and from the student perspective as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think we're going to turn to some audience questions now. So Emily, if you have some audience questions for us.
We do. Thank you. So just to follow up while it's still fresh in her mind, but Jessica, someone missed part of your answer. You were saying that reporters should be looking at decreasing numbers of blank on campus. I think you were saying early polling stations, but do you want to fill that in?
Early voting locations and voting locations on election day.
Okay, great. And also, can you just clarify what kind of clerks you're talking about? You're talking about folks at like the county clerk's office who may be responsible for election registration. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And it may not be called a clerk in your county. It may be the registrar of voters. It might be the supervisor of elections. But generally, if you just like Google your county name and elections, it will tell you where to go. And those folks are the ones that are doing the work.
Okay, this is a question I think for both of you, but if Chadwick wants to take it first, and it's from Charlotte West, and she's asking, is voter suppression more rampant than voter fraud?
Most definitely, I would say, and I say most definitely because we've seen voter suppression in the law, right? And we've seen voter suppression in numerous areas, specifically at students. And the idea of voter fraud, it's not to say that it's non-existent, but it's very, very, very minuscule, as opposed to us being able to see states taking very aggressive and very active opposition to student voting through gerrymandering, through student voter laws, through residential laws, and all of those things. So as far as being rampant, I would definitely say it's much, much more apparent, and it's much easier to track in a way where that's put in paper, right? And that's put inside the law, and we've seen how that could affect students and how it could affect communities of color as well.
You want to weigh in there, Jessica?
Yeah, I think that Chadwick is absolutely correct. And I think that the scare tactics around voter fraud are often used to justify laws that are suppressive in nature. I mean, we certainly saw that with the Texas voter ID bill. Even the people who wrote and advocated for that legislation couldn't offer any real examples of mass voter fraud, but they were still able to institute a deeply unnecessary barrier on every voter in the state. So I think that, voter fraud is a term that at this point I think means everything and nothing. The largest examples of fraud that we see are actually election fraud perpetrated by election workers and other officials, and not voters fraudulently casting ballots. And so I think that there's a distinction there to be made. And I think if we're going to write about voter fraud, then we have to do it with a lot of nuance, and we have to include very early in the story that either the allegations are unproven and likely not to be true, or that studies have shown that you are more likely to get struck by lightning than commit voter fraud, which is true. I think that the data bears this out. And so when people say fraud, 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 you really should question their motivations.
Okay, fair enough. Michael Vasquez wants to know, are there any national numbers regarding the reduction in campus polling sites or campus voting capacity on campus? And are you certain that the total campus voting capacity has gone down? Is that something that a statement that could be made now, or do we have to wait?
I feel like that's something we will have to wait to see. I mean, from a national standpoint, only because, like Jessica said earlier, you would have to really, really dig down into the local elections and to the voter registration in those areas and in that region of the city and where all of that is. From a national standpoint, we will really have to wait and see. I think one of the things that we have to remember is that when it comes to polling places, especially for early location, a lot of these colleges, just because they are huge, doesn't mean that those locations are only for the college, right? So they are for the surrounding communities as well. And so it'll be hard to specifically say right now that they have gone down until we get all the numbers in for those communities and then drill down to see what that is for those campuses.
Yeah, I think that that's right. I mean, the unfortunate reality of being a data reporter in elections is that there really is no national data on elections, and that leads to a lot of problems. Like, it's very difficult to compare the efficacy of one program to another county's program because they don't have data that talks to each other. And so we do have data like the Election Assistance Commission's EVES survey, and we do have things like the Open Elections Project. Derek Willis at ProPublica gets precinct level return data and puts that up online, but these are largely just individual efforts to make this data national. So you could absolutely write a local or even a state story on these voting locations on campus if your state maintains a consistently updated list of statewide polling locations. The state of Texas does, for example, although you do have to spend quite a bit of time cleaning it. And so it would be possible to get the data from the state of Texas, for example, geolocate the polling locations, and then make conclusions about how many campuses have been eliminated as voting sites. But that would, again, require additional reporting in terms of, was this shrank to a single polling location because you didn't want to have two, or because this is bigger and a better location? So it would still require some reporting out, but I think you could do it.
We have a question for Chadwick from Greta Anderson at Inside Higher Ed. She wants to know, are you seeing students request to have the election day off from their college in large numbers this year? And are colleges granting that request? And related to that, is there information or research you can share about having no classes on election day increasing turnout?
So there haven't, between our students and the students we work with and the colleges that we work with, we haven't heard any conversation about having election day off. The biggest conversation that we've seen is election day as a holiday as a whole. But I think one of the things that we've run into as far as election day off with students is that because everything is so virtual now, students have been being encouraged to vote early because it's more flexible, because they're able to run and go do things. And now maybe they're even able to do a little bit of work in line as well. I have not seen any data that is related to increasing the vote by giving students the day off, or that being a request of students at this point because of the transition to virtual. I think that would make more sense, and that would probably be more of a conversation if students were still on campus, right? And they could actually leave campus, or they could actually go to campus, or if a teacher decides to cancel class in order for students to go vote. But that's not necessarily the case because of displacement at this point. But I'm saying that as speculation. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any studies done or any statistics to that specific question of students having the day off and requesting the day off for voting.
Jessica, you mentioned that a good civic education is being a poll worker. So similarly on the K-12 side, is anyone aware of any schools or school districts that are doing a particularly good job at promoting civic engagement by educating students about elections and voter registrations?
Was that a question for me, or is that a question in general?
I think it's a question in general.
Okay, great.
It's possible that there may not be an immediate answer to that question. I think it's a good question. I think it's one reporters could be looking into. I will say there are definitely organizations that are tracking that. One place that you can look is Circle, which is a Center on Information and Research on Civic Learning and Education, and that's out of Tufts University. They do a ton of fantastic research in that area, and it's civicyouth.org. And they track things like civic engagement and civic education related to youth voter patterns in different school systems. So I definitely think if you're looking for that K-12 piece of that equation, that is where I would send you first, would be to Circle. Also, if you're looking at some state level organizations, there are places like the McCormick Foundation out of Illinois, which are looking at civic engagement and youth civic learning, particularly in the Midwest and of course in Illinois. So there are some state level organizations that are doing that kind of work as well. So we have time for just maybe one more question, and it's going to come from Jackson Hogan at the Bulletin in Bend, Oregon. He says, what is the best way to reach out to or speak with random students about voting, not just the super engaged one, when many campuses are shut down? Obviously, they can be difficult to access, and this reporter would rather not speak with students who are handpicked by a college staff if possible. So that's a great question, is how do you sort of cast that net for what might be the quote unquote average student versus a student that's already demonstrated a commitment to a political cause? Any tips there, Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this sounds like such an easy answer to this question, but being really engaged with these students on social media on the platforms that they actually use is the best way to do this. I mean, I know the only news organization that I'm aware of that has a huge TikTok presence is the Washington Post. So I was elated when they did an election land TikTok the other day. But,
yeah.
I think that we just need to think more creatively about how to make sure that our stories are being shared with people who are part of the same community, but that community is now dispersed. And so social media is one way, but then there are also options to do this directly through the school. So you should ask the student newspaper how they are distributing their articles to students, because they can't really distribute a physical paper right now, and that is really the bread and butter of student news. So maybe they'll let you buy their list of students, and maybe you can communicate with students directly and ask them questions. It could be that your school is a public school, and so the directory of students is probably subject to a public records request. You can make a large database of email addresses for students and send an email to see if they want a COVID newsletter or an election newsletter, but it might require some creativity and some new type of reporting.
I think that's a great tip. Chadwick, anything you want to add there?
No, I think that's the best thing. I think you are automatically going to get those most engaged students because they're having the conversations already and they're ready to talk. So as far as average student goes, maybe reaching out, like Jessica said, reaching out on social media to clubs and things that you don't think have the most engaged students. But then even that is a shot in the dark. So just do your best to be engaged on social media. Like Jessica said, that's the best I can add.
I just want to take a moment to thank our guests, Jessica Huseman of ProPublica and Chadwick Leonard of the Campus Vote Project, for taking the time not only to participate in this webinar, but to prepare for it. I also want to thank Elizabeth Hernandez, who just made her debut as an EWA moderator. Congratulations, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. Terrific job. Thanks also to Allison Kowalski of EWA, who handled the webinar logistics from behind the scenes. I know she's waving at me right now, even though you may not be able to see her. And finally, I want to thank all of you, all of today's attendees and EWA members who joined us to make this such a lively and helpful conversation. As soon as the webinar closes, you will see that evaluation survey. Please complete it. Your feedback is very important to us and it will help us to improve. We'll be posting a replay of this webinar just as soon as we can, so if you missed anything, remember everything was on the record. You're welcome to use this freely in your own reporting, and we have contact information that will go out for our speakers if you want to follow up individually with Chadwick or with Chadwick or with Jessica. So once again, on behalf of EWA, thank you very much for joining us. You can join ewa.org to sign up for our upcoming online and in-person seminars. And don't forget to listen to EWA Radio. This week's new episode is Alyssa Nadworny of NPR talking about her college road trip. And we always love to have new listeners join our podcast family. So thank you very much, everybody. We're going to close this event out. And again, we appreciate everybody's time and attention. Have a great afternoon and let us know if we can be of any help to you in the future. Have a great day.